Hello and welcome to the Middle East Teaching and Learning Conference. My name's Jeni Ling. I'm a leadership development consultant. This means I work in schools and beyond schools. I develop and deliver leadership programs for leaders at all levels. We're living in unprecedented times, and my thought to myself about this presentation was, how can I think about leadership when we're living in such a different time? We're dealing with rapidly changing, serious global pandemic impacted on lives across the world. What is important in leadership going forward? So in my presentation today, I'm going to identify key skills for education leaders before the pandemic. This would have been the core focus of any leadership program, an MPQ or any other leadership development program. But then look at how the school community needs may have changed and what international research says about crisis leadership. And then identify any new skills needed by school leaders in 2021. And celebrate the success of the distance learning programme in UAE. Closed in March. I was in Fujairah in a school there, and we were told that the schools were closing the next day, and it would probably be for 2 weeks, and before we knew it, in the next couple of days, it was till September. And so school leaders were immediately confronted with a number of urgent issues, such of which they hadn't seen before. It was important to provide meals and IT access to the vulnerable students and their families. There was also a need in many areas to upskill the teachers for the remote learning programme. A lot of schools were up to speed with it, but some needed quite a bit of training to get to enable them to deliver the distance learning programmes. And how to address the glaring inequalities across the school population. And what became evident, it was really important to support staff and student wellbeing as we were locked in and had lost all our normal structures and things that made our lives really. And in the midst of all these questions and uncertainty, the leaders still had to lead their schools. Their schools may not have been open in the normal sense, but they were still schools and communities. So they had to manage the current daily reality, but also be positive and give a forward-looking sense of hope and determination to persevere. I believe that school leadership teams have never been more important as they have been in the last 6 months and the next year or so going forward, as they are creating these new environments that support not just the students, but the whole community. My big question for today is, what does it take for leaders to succeed in these circumstances? Leadership in times of crisis. The pandemic has raised many challenges to our education systems, but it's also given us opportunities to reconsider how they can be improved. In times of uncertainty, effective leadership is vital. It gives community coherence, it ensures equity, and ultimately the trust and confidence that the community has in your school. There's clearly no easy route. Leaders themselves have felt unsure, they've been under pressure, and they've needed to react fast with no precedent and in a rapidly changing situation. They needed to identify the correct way forward. Which way was their school going to go, whilst reassuring staff, parents and the students that things were going to be okay. They needed to be open with questions that were asked of them, but also be truthful and candid, and if there wasn't an answer, to say so. And they had to persuade staff to stick with it, to follow through their decisions, even when their staff and themselves would have had all sorts of other pressures, such as social distancing. They may have been separated from families for a long period of time, and homeschooling, I know, which has been a challenge to everybody, including teachers themselves. And importantly, they need to be able to review things. If things haven't worked, they've got to be prepared to change it. And when they change it, tell people why and admit that things may not have been right and try again. Pre-COVID, I would argue that these were the most important aspects of leadership. They had to model outstanding classroom teaching and learning, and they had to understand what made outstanding classroom teaching and learning. Leaders at all levels need to be able to innovate and lead change, and set the direction and plan and carry out those plans and review and evaluate them. They've had to be able to motivate and influence others within the team and beyond the team. They need a professional credibility to enable them to do that. And they had to make the best use of professional expertise and knowledge on that team and know where to find it if it's not on the team. And value and demonstrate inclusive practices across the school. And it's also important that they fostered their teams and teamwork. It's not about the heroic leader at the front, it's about the whole team leading together. Leaders in schools do this through a confidence and a clear sense of direction. They need strategies for addressing underperformance, and they need to be able to influence and inspire their team and those beyond their team to come on board with their ideas. Leading and managing people is I always found one of the hardest parts, because you've got teams of colleagues with varying abilities and motivations, all needing a different style of leadership. I had a very clear idea of what sort of leadership I wanted to have as a leader, but I had a team that needed a very different one. And I think that effective leaders recognise that different styles are necessary, not only in different circumstances, but also with different people. It's vital that the leaders deliver school priorities. They need to detailed monitoring, evaluating data, observing lessons, all the normal aspects of monitoring, and then what do they do with it? They need to measure and evaluate the impact, as that's a key indicator of determining pupil progress. And there's no point in having all that data and information if you're not actually measuring the impact that it has. So has this changed? Are these still important aspects of a school leader's role? Is it the same post-COVID, or are there other priorities? And the rest of this presentation will have a look at some of those questions. Please answer questions and ask me questions in the chat down the side throughout this. So there's the question: are school leadership priorities for 2021 the same or different? Ideas, please. Many of you will come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I think that it's particularly relevant at the moment. I'll just quickly run through. The basic needs are the bottom two levels of the pyramid. Then comes the psychological needs, and then finally the self-fulfillment needs. Now, I think it's a really good way of looking at this current pandemic, because I think that many of us would have been quite high up on the pyramid to begin with, and we've all been knocked off. And I think for all of us, or certainly the vast majority, the basic needs for security, safety, and the physiological needs have become far more prevalent than they ever have been. Only once these needs, these basic safety and physiological needs, have been addressed, can we move higher up the pyramid to satisfy our psychological or self-fulfillment needs. And this can be very stressful. If we're used to working in a certain way, then suddenly our needs become very much more basic and fundamental, and we need to think about what impact that has on schools and school communities going forward. So a question for you, answers please in the chat. What are the implications of Maslow's hierarchy on your leadership? On your leadership wherever you are in the school, because my strapline is actually all teachers are leaders, because they are. We're all leading classes of students, we're leading colleagues, whatever level within the school we are. So whatever level you are, please put it in the chat. What are the implications of Maslow's hierarchy on your leadership? The school community requires those in leadership to provide real clarity and vision about learning, curriculum requirements, health and safety guidelines, and so on. And they need to be able to define the learning situations that allow their school to flourish, particularly in times of uncertainty, and particularly when those learning solutions may be radically different to those that we're used to. They need to instill confidence in the whole community to enable their schools to function, and ensure that mental health and well-being are a core focus in a way that they never have been before. When these are available and well communicated, then schools can be trusted to shape their responses and get on with the education. And I think that that's when the community trust is at its highest. Since March, schooling has been a very different picture. Without the physical presence of the building, which we've always associated with school, leaders have been engaging with tremendous creativity and professionalism to maintain their links with students and preserving the school community. They've been finding the right technology to connect teachers and their students and families, and a wide variety of technology has been used across the schools in the UAE. And they need to have made sure that the learning was adapted and coherent for all the different age groups and for their subjects. And some subjects were much easier than others to do this. And responding to staff and student wellbeing. And safeguarding students remotely, how can that be done? I think there's been a lot of worry, certainly in the UK, about vulnerable families and the impact that that's had on student safety. And at the same time, they've been monitoring the engagement of the pupils. They've been looking at all the feedback from students and parents and other staff, and monitoring the effectiveness of the curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum. Checking on reporting progress, and all the time that this has been happening, they've been home-based. They need to have looked after their own well-being and the homeschooling, very possibly, of their own family. And at the same time, they may well have been apart from their family. You may be an expat who haven't been abroad to see their family. Even within the UAE, seeing families across the various Emirates, I know, has been very challenging. Going forward into 2020, I know across the world there's been fears of a looming mental health crisis. And in some countries in particular, teachers are expressing great lack of confidence that they'll be able to deal effectively with what they'll be facing with vulnerable and traumatised pupils in September. And it seems to me, if you were comparing countries, then the countries that have been less well supported or have been led in a less directive approach, I think are feeling the effect more. I think that the countries where you've had a very clear plan and a rationale have given teachers and their community and the leaders much more confidence in what will be happening come September. They've still been dealing with lots of challenging issues and may feel very ill-equipped to deal with them. And there's been an increasing sense of isolation and uncertainty for everybody going forward. Particular needs were for pupils with mental health issues, those living in poverty, students with special educational needs who found the changes in routine and being locked in very stressful indeed, and it's had a huge impact, I know, on families of pupils. And adjusting yet again to another set of routines will again be challenging for them. Those without internet access will have struggled to keep up with so much learning happening online. And we all know vulnerable children that may not fit into specific categories, but still have found 6 months semi-isolation really very challenging indeed. The implications of this for teachers and for leaders is that many are planning specific support for bereaved or traumatised students. They're considering how to help children make transitions into new classes, new cycles or new schools. And there are particular concerns around exam year groups and what will happen with those. And I think those pupils themselves are feeling very unsure of what impact this will have on their education going forward. And there's a great feeling amongst schools that they want to prioritise wellbeing and rebuilding relationships with students and allowing more time for friendship groups to be re-established, talking about their experiences, being outside, doing exercise, all the basic needs from Maslow's pyramid. A few tips for staff wellbeing. I've seen great practice across schools in the UAE in terms of looking after their staff. And I think it's important to recognise your team's current reality. What is their current reality? I think effective leaders are in touch in more than one way with their staff, and they know what their current reality is. They know if they've had a bereavement, if they've been homeschooling, if they've not been able to see family. And it's important to acknowledge the new reality and respond to the new priorities. It's not a time for looking back, it's a time for looking forward. It's important to listen to them. I know over the past 6 months, lots of surveys have been going out seeing how people are, finding out what support they need. And it's really important that carries on going forward. And it's vital going forward also to invest in mental health and well-being. It's no longer a peripheral concern, it's the central concern. And checking in with staff during this difficult time, having good communication processes in place. I think it's really important to celebrate the key successes going forward. If you think back 6 months and you see how far schools have moved, they had no notice of this, they had a really short space of time, and it's been such a complex and uncertain world. And even now, as I'm recording this, perhaps 3 weeks before you'll be seeing it, there's no clear path in terms of what's going to happen in September. And all the time we have press commentators and news people talking about this is going to ruin life chances for generations to come. And I think that we as educationists have to be proud of what we've done and what we've achieved and celebrate that. So let's flip the narrative and actually look at what skills you and your students have gained during the 6 months. And I think this is a really positive activity that you could do with your staff when you get back. So list all the skills that you've gained in the past 6 months. I mean, there's been a huge increase that I've seen about pupils learning more independently, and I've seen this in very young pupils as they've started to take control of their learning and being able to do it very competently through varying IT systems. Creativity from teachers and from pupils have been really strong through this. And a much bigger increase of self-awareness and awareness of others and caring for others. And self-motivation, they've got to get themselves there in front of the laptop or in front of their PC. And I think that's just a starter of a few things that I've noticed. And I'm sure that you and your staff, if you spend quite some time really digging deep, you'll have a much longer list than that. Again, let's have some written down in the chat. What skills have you and your students gained in the past 6 months? Pop them in the chat and let's share those. The distance learning evaluations have been carried out in some private schools across the UAE, and they've demonstrated by and large that schools already graded as doing well have been judged as developed in distance learning. Those that were providing a good education still are, and there's some really outstanding distance learning happening in UAE. The concern is that this isn't everywhere. Not everywhere has had the funding or the staff expertise or the support to enable them to do this. So my question is, as educationists, what strategies can we use to ensure that all the good practice that's out there is shared equitably throughout the UAE? Answers in the chat, please. It's important to hold on to the school vision. I'm a great believer, and very often if I start working with a school, we start by looking at what their vision is. And does everybody buy into the vision, and do you know what the school's vision is? So my question would be, what is your school's current vision, and is that still relevant? Or does it need refining? Is the vision for your school 6 months ago still the vision for your school now? And what do we need to do to ensure that the vision reflects and drives the current reality? It's such an important time to bring people together, to have that focus and purpose. Who do we need to involve in that? And school leaders need to work to preserve and enhance the school community and shape the school vision so that everybody buys into it and everybody knows what the school priorities and the vision is. Building on the skills learned is going to be the key moving forward in engaging and consulting students in shaping these new approaches and using and extending the technology that's been available to staff and students. It's a time to build on it to move forward, identifying and building the key successes and deciding, bearing in mind Maslow, bearing in mind the past 6 months, deciding what the learning priorities are in the short, medium and long term, and making sure that everybody in the community recognises and buys into those. And identifying and supporting those students who work less well independently. The strategic planning going forward needs to allow for any eventuality. Anything could happen in September it could happen again in November and change in December. So the strategic planning needs to be able to react very quickly to any changes in the ongoing situation. Lots of positives have come out of the past 6 months, and the roles of schools as community support and providers has been more evident than ever. The schools have made a tremendous contribution to student health, wellbeing and equity. The schools have been the focus for that community, and I think that it's built very strong communities that are really important to take with you going forward. Meals have been provided for ancillary staff and for vulnerable families, and there have been lots of work developing ways to support students' wellbeing. And student staff, I think, have been supporting each other in all sorts of new and imaginative ways. Virtual tea parties and virtual coffee mornings and WhatsApp groups and all sorts of ways of supporting each other. And the parents are being more engaged in their children's learning. The learning has been taken into the home in a way that it never has been before. And how can we use that? How can we use that increased parental awareness of what's happening in the school and awareness of teaching in enabling them to go forward and continue that enhanced relationship? And I think one of the real positives has been a new appreciation of the role of the teacher. So many people are saying how wonderful teachers are in doing what they're doing, given the challenges of homeschooling. But I think that we as teachers have always recognised that it's much harder to teach your own children than it is to teach a class of 30 or an assembly of 500. We've all learnt that, I think, from perhaps bitter experience. More positives for school professionals. They've experienced learning beyond the physical building and had the opportunity to consider how to deliver lessons and apply them in all sorts of imaginative ways that weren't happening so much in the classroom. And they've done it so quickly and in times of need with very little time to plan strategically or reflect. And I think now's the time to reimagine and reshape the future. What is learning going to be like in your school in 2021 and 21-22 and so on? So what can we learn from research into crisis leadership? There are a couple of researchers, both Arjen Boyne and Ira Hesloot are from the Netherlands, and they've looked at crisis leadership over the past 3 or 4 years, and both. The first thing they say leaders should do is to acknowledge and demonstrate a rapid recognition of the danger and the reality of the situation that they're in. And they need to ensure that the necessary infrastructure and procedures are in place to gather data once that crisis is hit. They need to take action. They need to judge how much they can rely on certain people through persuasion, how they need to adapt their learning styles and know which learning style suits which situation and which individual. And communicate clearly through as many different channels as you can. I've seen all sorts of very strangely named channels that you're using in school, and being sensitive to the time and manner in which communication is delivered. It's always harder to deliver communication when it's not face-to-face, and you have to be very careful of the tone of the message and ensure the contents of the message is clear and consistent. Effective leadership can't be brought about simply by doing the right things. They need to clarify the problem and unite the population if they're to retain understanding and consensus. And all this will determine how much the damage of an emergency can be limited. There are pitfalls that leaders need to be aware of. Don't create a message that lacks consistency. It's really, really important that your messages are very clear and very consistent, because conflicting messages simply add to the feeling of confusion and distrust. I know we're all feeling confused, but it's really important that we're as clear as we can be in all our messaging, whilst avoiding the tendency to sugarcoat the situation. There's no point in saying everything's going to be hunky-dory when it's not. Leaders need to be really open about the evolving nature of the problem and recognise uncertainty exists. I don't know the answer to this, we'll work together and find it out. Adjusting decisions. It's really important that you don't keep on going down a road when you think it's clearly not working. You need to be able to adjust decisions when necessary, but really important, communicate clearly why you've changed that decision. Key messages for leaders. You must be open, because the community can quickly sense when you're not being straight with them, and that will immediately reduce your credibility. It's really important to deliver your message quickly. Don't let all the other narratives fill the space. Recognize how important your messaging is. It's so important, consistency and openness. And don't underestimate the impact of what you say. The things you don't say, as well as the things you do say, as well as the way you say it. 5 aims of effective messaging: offering guidance, a credible explanation of what's happened, instilling hope for the future, and showing empathy for how people are feeling. They all show that the leaders are in control, and if you fail on any of these, you begin to lose the community's confidence. Jacinda Ardern is a very highly respected leader, and we'll just look at how she responded to the COVID crisis in relation to those messages that we've just talked about. Her announcement was a clear example of skillful leadership. She freely acknowledged the challenges. She showed empathy in what's being asked of us. She had a very clear, concise speech, followed by extensive time for media questions. To be able, even if she didn't have the answer, it's important for people to have the forum to ask the questions. The lockdown was swift and tough. We must go in hard, we must go in early, was her message. And the rules were communicated effectively. Shortly before the strict lockdown, the government sent this message to all. It ticks all the boxes for effective leadership. Questions to consider going forward. Looking back over the past 6 months, what do you need to do more of, and what do you need to do less of? How will this be decided, and how will this be communicated, and how will it be reviewed and evaluated? Very simple questions that you're all probably quite familiar with, but it's really important that we decide and plan strategically as well as operationally in our move forward. This was my question at the beginning. Are leadership priorities for 2021 the same or different? I hope this talk has given you some idea where I think it is, and I'd be very interested to hear from you. Are they different or are they the same? Finally, consider how others are feeling. Show that empathy. Be honest, be candid about the challenges. Collaborate wherever possible. Use the expertise out there in the community. Show compassion for everyone in your community. This has been so challenging and life-changing for so many people, and yet for others it's barely touched them. Caring for others and for yourself. Don't forget self-care, the oxygen mask on the plane, put it on yourself first before you help others. Consolidate lessons learned. Be really clear what's worked well and what needs changing. And most of all, communicate, communicate, communicate. Any leadership queries you may have, please feel free to contact me. My email address is there. I'm also on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy the rest of the conference, and do get back to me if you have any queries or questions. Thank you.